Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about winter storage of your vehicle. This is applicable to any car, but more specifically we're going to focus on the Acura CL today. It's about 53 degrees today in the Northeast where I reside, and I start thinking about what I'm going to do to store the car. I usually pick a weekend in which I go through my checklist. My checklist is pretty simple, but really gives you a good idea about what you need to think about when it comes to winter storage of your vehicle. The primary topics you want to think about is preservation of your engine during the storage, preservation of your fuel system during storage, as well as rodent protection and tire protection. I'll talk about what those points are and what you need to think about as you store your car for the long term. I store my car for approximately 6 months, give or take a month or so. And in that time, I usually do some maintenance. I have a plan of what I want to do for maintenance during the storage time, so it's not completely stored away. I do check on it periodically, etc. Make sure that there's no rodents that are attacking the car and destroying any wiring harnesses, for example. But you can also take steps to mitigate that from happening in the first place, and that we should talk about. But where we start with the car is really doing an oil change, and I do that twofold. One, you don't want old oil storing in your engine. It has collected contaminants throughout your driving time, and then storing those contaminants within your engine will actually lead to a degradation of your engine long term. So what we're going to do is do the oil change, but we're also going to take a sample and send it off to Blackstone Laboratories to do an oil analysis. This vehicle has about 101,000 miles on it, and I put a couple thousand miles on it per year as I enjoy driving it during the summertime. But it's really good to take an oil sample periodically and understand what the condition of your engine is. So we're going to do that. We're also going to put some Stabil in the fuel tank to make sure that the fuel stays during the storage period. And I also, with that, fill it up so that it has a full tank, and that's really to mitigate any moisture content that may occur. So if you have a low tank, moisture likes to attract within the fuel system, and if you have a low volume of fuel in there, the tank can rust out. So by filling it all the way up and then putting some Stabil in there, you can prevent a lot of that from occurring. And then the other thing is I always give it a good wash. You also want to think about car cover, potentially, and if you have a concrete floor, laying some sort of underlayment under the car to prevent any moisture that's wicking up through the concrete and will, rust out the underneath of your car, whether it be fuel lines, brake lines, or just body panels and subframe. So let's go ahead and get started on that by pulling the car out and giving it a good wash. So actually we're going to get started by doing an oil change on this car, and then we'll do a wash. So the oil change will be pretty basic, nothing special there, but we are going to collect that sample, and you want to collect that sample based on the first run of the oil. So what is initially at the bottom of that sediment. Some people like to do it as it's warmed up. There's different methods of doing that, but I usually try to get the first draw out of there. That's really the concentrated volume of oil that I would want to get sent off to the laboratory for analysis. Alright, so we get the car jacked up. What we're going to do is go ahead and release the drain plug. This is a pretty basic procedure if you've ever changed oil, so nothing unique here. Other than that, we're going to take that sample. The instructions do say to try to take it from the middle of the stream. I do know that I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. I think I might do a little mix. I think I might do it a little bit at the beginning and then a little bit at the middle of it, just because I'm curious more about what it has settled as far as heavy metal contaminants, like oil will suspend particles to a degree, but after it's been resting for a period of time, you'll get that metal at the bottom, and I really want to understand if we have burying debris in there or any other sort of metal. So that's what I'm going to do now, and then we'll go ahead and send that off to Blackstone. going to send to Blackstone for analysis. And then we are going to refill the new oil in, obviously, back the car out, and start our wash process. So we've got the Acura CL all stored away for winter here in the Northeast. So what I do in preparation for winter, besides tuck it up against my two-car garage in the back of the wall here, is that we have to make sure that we, one, protect it from rodents, two, protect the fuel system, and three, we really want to make sure that we protect the underneath of the car as much as possible, because these are not sealed concrete floors. So what I do is I take some baking soda and I put it on the interior. Fuel system is treated with Stabil. Basically read the directions, and that's what I do as far as putting the proper amount of Stabil in there. I have a plastic sheet underneath the CL, and I also raise it up and put it on dollies. And the reason why I put it up on dollies is for twofold reasons. One, it's much easier to perform winter maintenance or tackle a project if the car is raised up a little bit. You don't have to go through the process of jacking it up. But also, these dollies prevent the tires from getting flat spots. So I'm running ultra high performance summer tires on this vehicle, and those tires are extremely susceptible to flat spotting, especially when you expose them to colder and then warmer climates and then colder climates again. The rubber in there ends up being basically hardened as they sit, and so when you drive it the first time in the summer or in the spring, you get that duck sound. So by putting it on dollies, the way the dollies are shaped, it really prevents that from happening. Not to say it doesn't happen a little bit still. Make sure that tires are properly inflated. That's important too, to prevent some of that from occurring. And then I put a car cover over it most of the time unless I'm working on a project like right now. So what I have back here is our Blackstone oil analysis, and I thought I'd run through that with you. One of the things that I was kind of surprised by this was what their comment was. So just to give you kind of a background on this, the oil use interval is approximately 5,000 miles from the point of when I put the oil in to when I'm actually taking it out and sampling it. That's about average, I would say. So I only drive this car about 5,000 miles per year, give or take, depending on how many nice days we have. So with about 5,000 miles of interval on here, their comments were that everything looks good in comparison to most of their sampling that they're seeing for the J-Series engines. Specifically, they kind of generalize this because they're not comparing it so much with other CL engines or J32A2 engines. They're really comparing it to Honda V6s, and since the J-Series is predominantly what we see in these vehicles. That's kind of their baseline comparison. So getting down to the results, everything looked great. I'll go ahead and post a picture of it so that you can see the comparison. Against the baseline. The only thing that was noticeable that they actually pointed out was that there's a high level of lead content in the oil, or higher than expected. So typically you would see a universal average of 2 is what they're saying as far as lead content, and they don't really give you a clear understanding of what they're talking about as far as lead content. Is that like, per liter, per what, but the lead content of the oil that was extracted and then sampled was 15. So from a baseline of 2 to 15, that kind of indicates that there might be some excessive wear going on, in particularly with the bearings. So lead is more commonly, lead and copper, I would say, are more typically found in the bearing material. And so when you're talking about engines that are higher than normal or expected lead content, that's likely excessive bearing wear. So why is that occurring? We don't know. Also, this is a first sample, so I'm not going to get all worked up about the fact that the lead content is a bit higher than expected when we don't have enough data points to really draw any conclusion with. So, what I would do is I would take that number and then I would sample it over a couple of other times and figure out what is the baseline. Do we have, was this an anomaly essentially, or was this something that we need to look at more extensively? And they even point that out. So it's a good thing that they give you their perspective about what they're seeing in comparison to other vehicles of this vintage or engine makeup. So they're saying, like, you might want to check for signs and symptoms of bearing wear, like do you have rod knock, would be one of the more extreme examples of this, where there's knocking occurring within the engine because there's play then within the engine between the crank and the connecting rods. And so if we have that play and it's knocking, then that's probably a strong indicator that we have bearings that have gone, and we need to remedy that, and that can be done in a couple different ways. But those are extremes, because when you're talking about engine internals, you're also talking about that you're going to have to drop the oil pan, and you're going to have to drop the lower baffles of the engine, and really disconnect your connecting rods from the crankshaft and replace those bearings or examine those bearings. Since you're going to be in there anyways, it's probably more prudent to just replace them. So at 101,000 miles, this vehicle, it's a little concerning, I would say. Not extremely concerning, because we don't have enough data points. So that's kind of where we're at with the Acura CL engine analysis. There was no fuel, there was no coolant in there, any indications of like a head gasket issue. So it's pretty stout, I would say. What we're going to do now that we have the Acura tucked away and stored is we're going to tackle some of the more pressing issues related to this car being a Northeast car. We kind of did that last year, but this year I think what we're going to do is take a look at the fuel lines, the brake lines, some of the items that have been exposed to the salt and debris of driving in the Northeast, and really see, is it more prudent to replace those now while the parts are still available, as opposed to waiting for something to fail and then having to source those parts when they might not be available. So the other thing is that we have ourselves a new filter for our intake system. So big shout out to Heel Toe Automotive and Marcus over at Heel Toe, who has these in stock. Funny enough, these are direct replacements for the Comtech or CT Engineering icebox. And so this car has been running an icebox for the past year. And unfortunately, what we discovered is that the filter that came with it from the seller when I source this, because you can't buy these new, so you're buying them second and sometimes third hand or more, is that at some point in its life, the intake filter was replaced with a generic intake filter, and so that's not in kind of the vein of this car, and trying to match it up with what we're hoping to achieve here, which is a purity correct modification. And so we're going to replace that today, and wrap up this video by installing this and showing how easy it is to install this. So let's get started on that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. One of the things I forgot to mention is that I always put my battery on a battery tender when it's being stored. It's just good practice if you want to keep the battery fresh for when you start it up in the summer. You don't need an expensive battery tender either. This battery tender that I'm using, I think I got for approximately $50 from Harbor Freight. It's their Viking model line, and I've used it for a couple years now in various different applications, and I find that it works quite well. It's got a winter mode, it's got like a quick charge, it's got a bunch of different features in it, so you really get a good bang for your buck when you're talking about a battery tender. And it's protecting your battery while it's being stored here, so that you don't have to worry about it in the summer. So that in itself is enough to justify that expense, I would say. So what we're going to do here is we're going to replace this filter that's inside here. Fairly simple. It's not going to take too long, but it's going to be pretty cool to see how this all goes together the way it was intended to go. So let's get started on that. Step here is just to put the cover back on, tighten down the 3 bolts. So hopefully this video educated you a little bit about storing your car for winter, and we tackled a mistake and corrected that mistake by putting in a new filter. Once again, shout out to Heel Toe Automotive for that filter and having it in stock, readily available. It's very difficult these days to find parts for these cars. You're either finding them second or third hand, and the fact that you can still purchase this brand new from Heel Toe Automotive is impressive. So I would highly recommend that if you have an icebox intake on your CL, or any car for that matter, head over there and take a look at their inventory. They might have just what you're looking for. Other than that, please leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on these videos. Hopefully I shared some experience with you and knowledge that you can take forward and apply it to your own applications. So this is filmed on Thanksgiving. I also say happy Thanksgiving.